everyone, welcome back to more Flesh and Bad. Today I wanted to kind of do a little bit of a departure from our normal kind of content where we do gameplay and kind of talk deck building discussion. So there are a lot of interesting things kind of happening with Zen right now, specifically a lot of like newer cards that are kind of popping up as well as kind of like macro strategies. So I wanted to kind of take a little bit of an opportunity to talk about them and kind of just share my thoughts on the deck lists I brought to the calling as well as like some of the deck lists that performed incredibly well during the calling. So uh, to kind of start with it, let's talk about the deck list I guess I brought to the calling. So this deck list kind of took a lot of different iterations. A lot of the core cards are kind of the same, so I kind of like created this core matchup to kind of talk about it. These are kind of what I consider to be kind of like core uncuttable cards from Zen. So you have like your Chase Aspect line, you have your really good blues, you have your Transcend cards, Wind Chakra, Warmongers, and CNC for the sideboard. Just like a very solid package of like very very good cards, and then you have these kind of like supplementary cards that are meant to kind of like support this kind of like main game plan, if you will. So in the board we kind of have, or not in the board but in like kind of like our B tier cards, basically we have, you know, like Flick Flack. Flick Flack is not, I would also kind of consider it to be kind of part of the core cards, or like some react, but generally like Flick Flack, Sink Below, like you'll normally see Zen decks with some combination of these, as well as I think Waxon's actually very very strong right now. It helps kind of like shore up the Aurora matchup, so you'll have some kind of like defensive package of most Zen lists. Tiger Eye Reflex, also a card that has been kind of impressing me. So this card at face value seems really really bad, and I think that's what kind of tripped me up a lot about it. So it being a 3 block is not necessarily what you want to be doing against a lot of decks. So like Enigma and Florian, you don't really want to be necessarily blocking them. Similar for like aggro matchups, like you don't really want to be necessarily blocking if you have to be blocking, or like having too much block, and it's basically like a below rate card if you're just blocking with it. But you kind of got to think of this as like a predatory streak that gains you 3 health, right? So that's obviously a lot better. And I think that's kind of what this card does in a lot of cases, is it's just like creates a tiger that kind of like enables your like pouncing keys and your spinning and your like breed angers and stuff like that. But it's also just like very solid for covering up like disruption. So like weakest link, CNC, you know, amnesia, those kind of things. So very very impressive card. Again, I think this card can be cut down to like maybe a 2 of, because it does get a little bit clunky at 3. But again, it's a very very solid card. In the board we also have, so in kind of like our non-core cards, we also have E-Strike. So E-Strike, this was originally Growl in my list. And the reason, so Jude the from the top 4, Jude actually convinced me to kind of change this over from Growl to E-Strike. And I think one of the biggest appeals of E-Strike is it's just being a block 3 that can help you like unbrick your hands. So against New, this card is very very strong. Against like aggro matchups like Aurora Zen, this card is kind of like whatever. It being like a block 3 is like fine, but again, it's not like a super aggressive card or anything. It's mostly just kind of like a good glue card that lets you have a lot of like flexibility with your hands, and also being like a 3 block is just very very good. And that kind of brings me a little bit to kind of like the core theory of this deck, is that this deck blocks incredibly well. So majority of this deck is 3 blocks. Like if we take a look at, let's not take a look at the default matchup. Let's take a look at Aurora for example. So if you look at the block values of this deck, we see 39 3 blocks, which is incredible. The 9 0 blocks are our Transcend cards, which we're not going to want to block with anyways, right? And then we have 6 2 blocks, and then 6 reacts at 4 blocks. So, all right, this is just for the Aurora matchup. I'm sure this changes if we go to like default matchup. You can see that we have like more reacts, more 3 blocks, etc. So, anyways, that's kind of like the core theory of the deck, is that Zen just blocks incredibly incredibly well, and it lets you kind of like come back in a lot of scenarios where you probably like wouldn't be winning the game just by having this kind of like 3 block density, which is really really good. So let's go back to the core cards a little bit more. Warmongers and CNC, I think we already talked about those. Let's talk about like Pouncing Key and like some of these like other combo cards. So Breed Anger is a card that I trimmed between me and Jude's list. I think this is like the main difference. I basically trimmed down on 1 Breed Anger and went up on like a Waxon, anticipating a lot of news, but actually the representation was, I think the highest representation was Aurora during the calling. So I think the Waxon's still fine into Aurora, but like Breed Anger is also very fine. I did kind of miss the third Green Anger and like the Enigma matchups, which I didn't perform incredibly well in. But I did like the Pounce and Keys. So another kind of card that Ju convinced me. So I was originally on the red Pounce and Keys because I think this card is very, very strong. Just being a 0 for 4, go again. Conditional is obviously very, very good. It's like Tiger Swipe 4 through 6 basically in the deck. So very, very aggressive card, very, very good. Blue Pouncing Key is kind of similar. So I like to think of Blue Pouncing Key as more of like a bad starter. So what I consider to be a starter in Zen is basically a blue card that lets you transcend. So Biting Breeze is a starter, Ancestral Harmony is a starter. All transcend cards are basically starters of themselves. Levels can also be a starter, but like Warmongers is not a starter because it doesn't have Gogan, right? So this card is very, very good as like it kind of can be a starter if you want to use your boots to basically like create a tiger and then force through transcend. So it being like a 3 block that also can help you transcend is quite good. But being 3 of is like whatever. Initially, I think in one of my older lists, I was on like a blue Key Unleashed, which we did see. So this is kind of like the maybe word, but we did see actually that in Cody's list. So Cody, I think, was running. He's running the yellow Key Unleashed. Oh, and a blue Key Unleashed. So he's running both. But I think the idea is pretty solid for blue Key Unleashed. Blue Pouncing Key can definitely feel like maybe a little bit too excessive because you don't always want to transcend off Blue Pouncing Key. But here's also like an upside of Blue Pouncing Key is that if you like hit it off Harmony, you're not like priced into doing some weird stuff with your resources to try to force you to play like a blue Key Unleashed. So like there's a situation where you go like Harmony, transcend, like you Harmony and hit like Key Unleash off the top off a 2-card hand, right? And let's say you make a resource off Kasaya, then you have you have to basically pay 2 resources in order to get the value out of your Key Unleashed, which means that you have to like tutor, like there's basically nothing you can tutor that will let you cast that and also get the value off it. So it's kind of a brick off of Harmony, which is like weird, but it's also just like a good tutor target if you do like double transcend. It's definitely like a card that's like on the cusp, but the reason we opted not to run it is basically because being as always guaranteeing a 0 cost after your Harmony hits, it kind of like is a little bit more value as opposed to like randomly hitting off Key Unleashed, or randomly hitting Key Unleashed off Harmony is kind of like whatever. Yeah, but that's most of the cards, and then we were running one of Winds of Eternity just for like a random combo card that you could sometimes tutor if you play 100 Winds. Pad's combo count is a 3 block, and then New doesn't also use this incredibly well, which is actually why we should probably talk about Blue Pouncing Key. So New does not use this card very well at all. Like 100 Winds and Bitey Breeze and Levels are kind of like the cards that New uses the best. Wind Chakra as well if you're running Bitey Breeze, but yeah, in general, that's kind of like why we're running Winds of Eternity is just because like New can't use it super well unless you're banishing 100 Winds. Okay, so that kind of covers most of the core cards. Also, like Sink Below is very, very good in terms of like digging for Transcend. And then the 2 Cosmics are mostly just to kind of like respect 2 IB decks while also being like playable into New just as like a blue 3 block that doesn't do anything for them. Yeah, so those are kind of the core cards. And let's take a look at like kind of some of the matchups. So into Aurora, we run like a very, very defensive package, cutting most of our 2 blocks. And this is kind of like the main theory of the deck is that, you know, blocking 2 is not great, right? So we want to be able to like board out a lot of our kind of crappier 2 blocks for reacts in certain matchups. Yeah, so let's take a look at like Viscerai, for instance. I had to fix the sideboard, which is maybe why you saw the pause there. But basically, for Viscerai, we want to have kind of like our spinning and 100 Winds like for just having like a very aggressive package in them because we want to be the aggressor. And then we're also cutting a lot of our reacts just to kind of like try to force through damage. So these are kind of like the 2 pivots between the deck. Again, I think Florian's also pretty similar in terms of matchup. Like we maybe don't want the Warmongers, but pretty much we want like an aggressive package into like Florian, Enigma, and Viscerai for the most part. Let's also like take a look at like the Mirror, for instance. So I think this is what I would normally run into the Mirror. So the Mirror, I think, leans a little bit more defensive, but we're mainly using Sink Below here just to kind of dig for Transcend. And then Flick Flack, I don't think you need like all 3 Flick Flacks. I think like 2 Flick Flacks is probably the right amount. But we basically just want a little bit of like defensive coverage for like big chase to tail turns, for turns when we're not able to like convert our hand incredibly well. And I think that's kind of what it accomplishes. Let's talk about kind of cards that didn't really make the cut. So We already talked about Blue Key Unleashed. I think Blue Key Unleashed is like fine to include in the deck. Like I don't think it actually changes all that much. But again, we talked about it being a little bit awkward off Harmony hits. Uh, Growl was a card that I was basically in place of E-Strike for the longest time. But again, if the theory of the deck is that you want to basically be almost always able to like block 3 like incredibly well or block 6 incredibly well. Growl doesn't really fit into that game plan because it ups our kind of like 2 blocks to 9, which is not ideal. Flex Claw is again similar, like kind of similar slot to like E-Strike. But again, problem is it being a 2 block, and then sometimes you like can brick with this if you draw like a bunch of 1 costs. Whereas with E-Strike, you can never really brick like that. And again, similar thing for Bittering Thorns. Let's also kind of talk about like Erase Face and Weakest Link. So Erase Face has gone down a lot in value just because of Dio's kind of bans. It's pretty good into like Viscerize still, and maybe even into Aurora a little bit, but like not incredibly like game breaking into Aurora. Similar thing with Weakest Link. Like Weakest Link on paper should be really, really good into Aurora and maybe even like Zen, but the problem is it's just so slow and they have such a big fridge. So like good Zens, like Jude and I basically did the Zen mirror for like 5 or 6 games. I think it was 5. But what we found was Jude was running like I think 3 of or 2 of Weakest Links, and he had them. I think he drew them a lot of the games. But the problem was like I knew he was running them, or I was trying to play around like CNC basically, which is something you should always do in Zen anyways. And the problem with this card is it basically is like kind of card neutral, so you're paying 2 cards to take 2 cards out of my hand basically. So it's very easy to like play around this card and to kind of like respect this card if you know your opponent has it, or if you know like most people run CNC in the Zen mirror, so being able to kind of like respect a 2-card 6 is kind of one of Zen's specialties, and I don't think this card actually gives you that much of an edge in the Zen mirror. It used to be a lot better with like Zephyr Needles because you could like bait them into blocking with the 3 block, and then you could force through a Weakest Link. But with Kakara, the resources just don't line up incredibly well. One card that's also not in kind of this maybe section was Censor, which was a card that I was trying to be like a Zen mirror breaker. But that also just kind of felt like budget Weakest Link, right? Because good Zens will always try to respect, like, may not respect Censor as much because you're like, most Zens like don't respect like the 1 resource floating basically. 2 resources you respect, but 1 resource you don't. So it was a little bit better in that regard, but again, like nothing, like you name Crouching Tiger or something and you can get lucky with that, but it's not like necessarily like game breaking or anything. The card is like a 2-card 7 in a new, which can be pretty good. But again, it doesn't really stop their like mask finish thing, so it's not like a overperforming card. I initially also had like 1 snag in the sideboard on my list. I think it was probably taking the place of one of these Wax-Ons. And that was more so for blue density against new, and just kind of like have a little bit more blue density if we're boarding out like our levels and our like Hunterwinds or Biting Breezes. But again, this card got cut just because I don't think it's actually like it's good into new for sure, but like when you compare it to like Wax-On, which is like base a 3 block, like Snag gets a lot worse, and this Wax-On is basically kind of in most scenarios it is basically like the same card as Snag, assuming your opponent is like playing pretty well, and they're not like just dumping a like 2 Venomous on like a random attack or something, right? Another card that didn't make the cut for our list is Wax Off, and this is kind of like a spicy card that I know a lot of people love, and I want to talk about why we weren't running it. So main deck, I think this card is very, very weak. And I think there are a lot of decks that aren't main decking it. Like I think Cody was talking about not main decking it. I think he like main decks the Cosmics or like the Warmongers in most matchups, or something like that. But again, main decking Wax Off feels really, really bad because it's a 2 block. And in the matchups where you're not running Wax On, this is like a 2 block. This is like a blue sink below, kind of like an Enigma, right? Which is fine, but you're not getting like the filtering out of blue sink below. And transcending on your opponent's turn is also kind of bad for this deck. So like it's not something you want to actively be doing, right? So with Enigma, like you can like make a Spectral Shield at the end of their turn and then like untap or like go to your turn and then make another Spectral Shield, right? But like with Wax Off, we're basically losing like the Kasaya resource, which is really, really valuable. So like if you want to do like, let's say you had Wax Off, transcend in hand, and then like an aspect to Tiger Body in hand, right? So what you can't do with that hand is chase aspect, which is basically what you want to be doing with the deck in the first place, right? So if you have to transcend on your opponent's turn with wax off, it's really bad because you can't use that Kasara resource to play Chase the Tail. So that was kind of the theory on why we cut wax off. It's obviously like very good into Aurora if you can get to line up, and like just a very good card. I've heard people talk about this being good in the mirror, but I've yet to kind of see it. I think it's like fine in the mirror, but again, getting it to line up seems a little bit suspect in my opinion. And yeah, being a 2-block into matchups where like you're not playing wax on is like kind of a liability, because like let's say you get hit by a CNC and you have like 2 wax offs in your hand, right? That doesn't feel good. Like I don't think this card feels good in main deck is basically what I'm trying to get at. But I don't think so. The Runaways were actually on wax off, and we'll kind of talk about this list a little bit more in detail later. But they are on wax off, I think, in the sideboard is what Cody was saying. I was kind of looking at his messages in purple at one point, and he was basically talking about, I think he doesn't main deck this card. I'm guessing he main decks either like Cosmics or the Warmongers in some matchups. Probably depends. But yeah, that's kind of like, I think it's probably fine if it's a sideboard card, but main deck, I think this card is very weak. We were also considering like extra Winds of Eternity, but I don't think it's super necessary because you most of the time don't want to be tutoring for this card unless there's like a really weird hand. It being a 0/4 is fine. It can sometimes proc Shuko, but again, it's not super noteworthy. Let's talk about AB as well. So we are on AB1, which I think is really good against Aurora and Viserai. Those are basically like the 2 matchups that I really want AB into. Against Florian, you don't run any AB because it's a race matchup, and against oh, actually, Vincent is a matchup that I would run Tide Flippers into. So that is also notably one, but again, as we know, Vincent, not a real deck, right? But yeah, so like Tide Flipper is pretty solid. Again, I think you can also like make the argument for doing like Null Gloves, but losing Shuko is obviously pretty rough, and being able to block 6 is also very good. I was considering running a Null Rune Hood I think I was considering running Null Rune Gloves for AB2 against Acilio, because I've heard that that's a lot better than AB1 against Acilio. And there were like something like 20-something Acilios at the calling, which was pretty crazy. I didn't pair into them. I think I paired into them the day before. But yeah, AB2 against Acilio can be pretty good. So I was considering that the day before the calling, and then Zephyr Needles. I don't think Zephyr Needles are kind of real anymore. I think the format's just gotten too slow, especially with like this more kind of like defensive package that we want to be running. Like, I don't think there's really room for Zephyr Needles, especially when we're kind of like cutting into sideboard space against like CYB decks, basically. Yeah, so that's kind of like the main story behind this deck. I think there are like other cards we were considering at different points, but again, a lot of them are kind of like escaping me right now. I think the main ones were like Growl, one of the Key Unleashed, basically. Wax Off was a card that I was testing, and then like Stag was also a card. So like these like 5-ish cards were cards we were testing, and I think Jude was testing Weakest Links, but again, I don't think those ended up being very good. Yeah, so we'll go to Jude's list as well. So Jude, basically same exact list. Breed Anger over Wax On, basically. Nothing much to say here. I did take a look at his Enigma matchup, so he's not actually running any of the Tiger Eyes into Enigma, which is pretty good. I think I'm forced to basically run at least one into Enigma, which is not the end of the world, because it does make an extra like Chain Link, which can be kind of annoying, but again, you don't necessarily want to have to be blocking against an Enigma. But this card didn't really like lose me any games or anything. I think I lost basically due to like brick hands and stuff like that. Yeah, but that's kind of like the core of the deck. Let's also talk about the Runaways deck. So the Runaways deck actually has a lot of ideas that I've had before. So we have What If Breed Anger. I think this was already a card they were considering. If I took a look at like some of their older deck lists. Flex Claws, I think, also a card that I think they were running in Worlds. Growl, I think, was a card that they were also talking about. Again, Growl being a 0/4 all that time is pretty good. But again, the 2-block, if we look at kind of like the 2-block stats here, let's take a look. We're running like 15 2-blocks in this deck, which can feel kind of rough, but again, definitely like more aggressive. So to start with the Runaways list, I basically don't know how to sideboard it, so I'm kind of just making assumptions here. But if we look at kind of like our more aggressive package into Florian, for instance, so this is a Jude's Florian matchup. Let's take a look at our 2 blocks. So we're running 12 2 blocks into like the more aggressive matchups and like 6 into the non-aggressive matchups, being the Biting Breeze and Underwinds. But if we take a look at the Runaways list, I think we're basically on like 15 2 blocks main deck, which is like three more than we're running basically. Assuming this is into more like aggressive matchups. In the board, we have like wax on, wax off, like red, wax on. Again, not a huge surprise. Sink below and flick flack. Again, the ratios here are a little bit weird, but again, it kind of makes sense to make room for like the yellow wax on. Which, by the way, let's talk about yellow wax on for a second. So this is actually a card that I was running way back when I was testing wax on, wax off for the first time. So I don't want to claim credit for this, but I was actually kind of on the right track with like 3 red wax on, 1 yellow wax off, and then the wax off package, just so you can have like kind of redundancy in your wax on, wax off stuff. So this is pretty good into Aurora. And looks like Cody at least was kind of agreeing with me. So having 4 wax ons, 3 wax off seems to be like a pretty good ratio. Here we also have a Yellow Key Unleashed, and I've heard them talk about Yellow Key Unleashed a little bit. So this is to play around the Essence of Ancestry. What is that card name? Okay, yeah. So this was to play around like Essence of Ancestry body. So this is why they're running the yellow as opposed to the red or like the blue. Well, I guess they are still running the blue, but it's basically a play around that card. So it being a yellow is kind of interesting. Also, it gets procced by Shuko, which is pretty good, and then it also kind of can randomly like save you from Persuasive. So pretty solid. Yellow, that all you got is kind of a mystery to me still, but it seems pretty good into maybe like the mirror as well as like into new is pretty solid. I don't know if you want to run this into Aurora. It's probably not terrible, but again, I think you probably just want your like wax on, wax off package if I had to guess. And then they're kind of going up on a Cosmic, same number of Warmongers and Tide Flippers, so pretty similar to our list all in all. They are cutting down on Breed Anger, which is a card that I decided to cut down on the day before. So going to 1 Breed Anger is also kind of like a pretty reasonable choice. Notably, this deck does not have any spinning wheel kicks, which is kind of interesting. So no spinning wheel kicks and no pouncing keys either. So we're basically kind of having to main deck some of these like blue 3 blocks. So whether it's the wax offs, the cosmics, I think you generally want to be doing this at like 29. So like I'm assuming that the default configuration maybe looks something like this. And then maybe like put the key unleash in there, and then that's kind of like the board. So I'm assuming this is like the default like aggressive package, and then I assume into like Aurora or whatever you want to bring in some of these more like defensive cards, Warmongers, and then like maybe I don't know if you want that all year on Aurora, but like probably just cut some of these like aggressive cards for some of these more like defensive cards basically. Let's also take a look at like their combo count. So this is kind of like an interesting point of contention. So we're looking at the default matchup, which is like the main 60. We're running basically 22 combo cards, which if you look at like Jude's list and you look at my list, we're running 31, which seems excessive. But I think that there's like, oh, actually, am I running 27? Okay, this isn't a Zen though. Let's take a look at the like default match, or no, let's take a look at like Enigma. So into like Enigma, I'm running like 30 combo cards. Jude's running like, let's take a look at his Enigma matchup. I think he's running like 31. So yeah, basically we're at or around like 30 combo cards. And I think that's pretty solid. So they're basically losing out on like 8 or so combo cards, which is pretty substantial. But when you think about it, like they're basically just using Ancestral Harmony as like a Transcend starter and not like banking on this ever hitting anything. But you can just get a lot of like game-winning RNG off this card. So I think I can kind of justify having some of these like combo cards. I think they're pretty good, and they also give you a little bit of like threat density into like new. Specifically like CYB new, like having the ability to always have 2 your target is very good. But yeah, that's kind of like Cody's list. Again, Cody probably can talk a little bit better than I can about this list. So again, I'm not the deck author. I'm kind of just making assumptions as to what I think that the deck author is thinking. But yeah, again, this is like a very solid list and pretty similar all in all to our list. I think our biggest disagreement here is just whether or not wax off is worth it. And I think I actually kind of agree with Cody here in that given the field of the calling, which was I think like 90 something Auroras. Like this card is very, very good into Aurora, but I think that's kind of where the card is at its best. Like I don't think this card is really that good into like anyone else. Like it's okay into the mirror, and it's okay into new, but I wouldn't say that this card is like game winning or any by any like stretch of the imagination, basically. So that was kind of like a big rundown of kind of like Zen deck building theory. I did want to kind of like give some space to kind of like talk about, I guess, like something interesting, I guess I brought up on like Purple Discord. So one thing that I think people struggle with the most with Zen is like figuring out how to use Kasaya. So this is a little bit of a segue. Kasaya is like the Zen state on Kasaya can be used in basically like two different ways. And I kind of categorize these as the proactive Zen state and the reactive Zen state. So when I say proactive Zen state, I mean you're basically making it at the end of your turn, and then you're passing to your opponent, and then your opponent has to basically fight through a Zen state. So the proactive Zen state is really, really good when your opponent keeps a 5-card hand. Because then you're basically having to force them to play their 5-card hand into you, and then you get a lot of just value forcing them to play through your hands. The reactive Zen state is really good against decks that like make rune chants, for instance, like Viscerai, where Viscerai, if you make a proactive Zen state, can basically just pass the turn and like just like make a bunch of rune chants with like like Rune Blood Incantation or what. Like I don't think they run Rune Blood Incantation anymore. I'm trying to think of the card. Deadwood Dirge. They make a bunch of rune chants with like Deadwood Dirge and pass, right? And then like your Zen state's not actually getting you any value because your opponent's actually just like blocking out, right? So the proactive Zen state's not very good against some decks, but against other decks like Aurora, like they don't really have a lot of ways to break Zen state, except like I think someone was telling me that like their local Aurora runs like Blast to Oblivion, but like I don't think that's like the norm. But anyways, like proactive Zen state is very, very good against some decks. Reactive Zen state, which is when you make your Zen state in response to something your opponent is doing, is very, very good, but it's also a little bit harder to line up than the proactive Zen state. So these are kind of like the two situations where you want to make Zen state, and knowing when to make a Zen state into which matchup is kind of very important for the deck. It's a very, very skill testing card, and I think there's a little bit of mind games involved through it too. So like one thing you can do if you have like 2 Transcend cards in hand and a blue, like let's say you have like Biting Breeze, Pathful Travel, Passover, right? And that's your hand. So like you attack with Biting Breeze, you Pathful Traveled it, and then you send like a 1 cost, right? That's pretty good. But if you're using your pass out, like you can either basically at the end of your turn choose whether or not you want to pass over something. So if your opponent, if you do like Biting Breeze, Pathful Traveled, and then 1 cost, and then you basically go to move to end of your turn, and your opponent hasn't done anything, like they want to keep a full grip and do next turn and just send a ton of damage, you could either choose to basically Arsenal Passover and say, I don't care about your damage, I'm going to basically try to do a really big pop-off turn next turn. Or you can basically use this Passover to create a Zen state at the end of your turn after your opponent's kept a 5-card hand, and then it basically neuters their entire next turn, right? So that's kind of like the proactive kind of play pattern. And the reactive play pattern is basically like kind of like double transcending on your opponent's turn, like sandbagging a chi or naturally drawing into a chi. So those are kind of like the situations where you make a Zen state. So yeah, I think that kind of just about wraps up a lot of the Zen deck building discussion. I think, so I do want to kind of briefly touch on Enigma. So I think Enigma has gotten a lot tougher just because a lot of their cards are like very, very good. And if they slam a mirror guy, some games you will just like basically automatically lose on the spot. One thing I was considering for Enigma was like growls and like flex claws and stuff like that. And while those are good, it feels like, I don't know how much it actually helps. Like the growls definitely do feel like they can like give you an extra chain link that could matter against Enigma. But again, I think that there are some games against Enigma where you will basically just lose on the spot. Like some of the games I saw at the Culling were basically like slam turn 0 10k, I keep a mid hand or whatever, right? And the game is basically over from that point because they deal like 20 damage to me from there, and I can't do anything about it, right? So that's kind of like, the Enigma matchup is tough just because they can high roll you pretty bad. But again, if you play, like if you have above average rates, I think you're pretty favored in that matchup. But again, shit can happen, that kind of stuff. So that kind of covers most of the Zen deck building discussion. Again, this is kind of meant to be like a longer form, kind of no gameplay video, just kind of like talk through a lot of my thoughts. And again, it did get a little bit rambly there, but I think I was trying to kind of just talk through all of our choices and kind of give you the best information. One thing that I have not tested at all is Jarl, so I was kind of focused on the culling, so I never got a chance to actually like play in any Jarl. I don't think it changes the deck like all that much. Like we maybe run like an extra cosmic or maybe up the blues to like 30 or something as opposed to like 29. But like again, I don't think that Jarl's that scary from what I've heard. But again, I haven't played into him a ton. And actually, that kind of brings me to like an interesting segue. So let's talk about like ratios and stuff. So again, 29 blues seems to be kind of like the solidifying point. So I think Jude was on like 30 blues, but let me actually check like his Aurora matchup. So he's like on 29 30. Cody's also, I'm assuming, on 29, although this could probably change with like some of the reacts that he's bringing in maybe. So you want 29, I think, into most matchups. I think if you're going above 29, you have to have like a really good reason to. And again, I don't think there's like a really compelling reason to go above like 30. 28 is also probably like the lower end of what I'd run in terms of blues. Just because like I think if you dip below like 27, you're kind of running the risk of basically drawing like a bunch of all red hands, and no one really wants that. So yeah, that's kind of like at a macro like deck building kind of level, like that's probably your kind of ratios that you want. The Tiger Eyes, I don't really count as blues. I count these more as like reds. Just because like the blues you really want for like levels and like transcending and stuff. Like I think having 29 blues, like most of which are playable. Like the Cosmics I think are functionally like cracked baubles. Same thing with like Winds of Eternity, but like they're basically kind of like padding blues, and then most of these other blues you basically want to be able to play like on demand basically. Yeah, so that about wraps up kind of like the deck building discussion. I feel like I've rambled on a little bit, but hopefully that was kind of interesting. If you have any questions about like Zen deck building and kind of like what cards I'm still actively kind of considering, feel free to let me know. But this is pretty close to like just a list that I would just run into most everything now. Again, I might like to experiment with like cutting some like pounds and keys or whatever, but like again, the list that Jude and I kind of collaborated on is very, very solid. Cody's list is also very good as well. I haven't given this list a shot, but I want to kind of try it eventually later this week. Again, I don't have like the sideboarding information. This is just like a copy I took from like the tournament results. Yeah, but I might give this list a shot. Just I'm assuming it's kind of similar to kind of normal Zen sideboarding with kind of like similar game plans basically. Yeah, but that about wraps up the video for today. Let me know what you guys all think about like certain card choices or like any other kind of like questions you have about Zen at like a kind of like high level. And tomorrow I think we'll do a little bit more gameplay. Maybe we'll do some Living Legend this week just to practice for skirmish. Yeah, but with that, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time.